Members of the jury, you've been called here today to hear evidence from a genuine criminal trial. We ask you take this task seriously and conduct yourself as if you were called to serve on a criminal court jury. The information you are about to hear relates to the trial of Dan Jones, who has been charged with one count of gross bodily harm, and David Phillips, who has also been charged with one count of gross bodily harm against a male called Callum Moore. Your role is to listen to the evidence and testimony provided and follow the instructions given to you by the judge before deciding on the verdict of guilty or not guilty. Please do not discuss the case with your fellow jurors until instructed otherwise. The case will now begin. Members of the jury, you have been called here today to undertake an important public duty that will require you to decide the guilt of the defendants who have entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of grievous bodily harm. Shortly, you will be asked to consider the evidence in this case before deciding whether you find them guilty or not guilty in relation to this charge. Before we begin the trial, it's important you understand your role as the jury. As members of this jury, it is your role to be the judge of the facts and evidence you will hear. You are likely to hear competing accounts of the same event, and it is for you to determine what you consider factual. At the end of the trial, you will be asked to return a verdict you must base on the evidence alone. By the same token, I ask that you postpone your final judgment on the evidence until all the evidence is complete. In an instant where you find the defendant guilty, you must be sure beyond a reasonable doubt. If you are not sure of his guilt, then you must return a verdict of not guilty. In this day and age, it is also important to remind you that discussions about the evidence should only take place when all 12 jurors are present in the jury room. Likewise, you should not discuss the case with anyone outside of your fellow jurors, not least family and friends whose views you may trust, either face-to-face, over the telephone, or over the internet, including on sites such as Facebook. Not only would doing so run the risk of disclosing confidential information, but could consciously or otherwise have an effect on your own judgments in the case. Finally, you should be aware that within English law, we have a system of open justice, in which the representative parties themselves decide what evidence is to be included at trial. It is upon that evidence alone that you, the jury, must reach your verdict. You should not attempt to find further information about the case from any other sources, including from the internet. Doing so would be unfair to both the accused and the complainant, because neither would be aware of the research and its results upon your verdict decision, and therefore would be unable to respond to it. The trial will be structured like this. First, you will be presented with the undisputed information about the case, meaning those aspects that both the prosecution and defence agree happened. After this, you will hear the alleged victims' versions of events, and the alleged offenders' versions of what happened. After all the witness testimony and evidence has been heard, you will be given some further instructions from me. In the meantime, however, if you feel it will help you make your decision at the end of the trial, you may make notes throughout on any aspects you see fit. The evidence will now begin. On the 24th of November 2023, the defendants Dan Jones and David Phillips worked as doormen at Lunar Lux nightclub. Lunar Lux was hosting an event for a local band in which under 18s 14 plus were allowed in attendance. In attendance that evening was the complainant, Callum Moore. Callum Moore attended with friends, drinking. He was kicked out of the club for his behaviour. However, at approximately 21:17, he returned and threw pint glasses at the front of the club. One of these glasses hit a 17-year-old in the face. The complainant, Callum Moore, runs away from the defendants, Dan Jones and David Phillips, chase after him. In the chase, Callum Moore is struck by a silver Mercedes, the speed of which is disputed. The complainant, Callum Moore, is restrained on the floor by the accused, Dan Jones and David Phillips. Police are called, and when they arrive, Callum Moore is in a pile of blood and has received injuries to his nose and jaw. There are different accounts of the struggle between the accused and the accusers, including 3 witness statements. You will now hear an account of what happened that night. However, for ethical reasons, their faces will not be shown.
2 doormen start running after me after the incident outside the club, so I ran, just like an instinct after doing something bad. I did not look behind me, I just ran. I got to a point and stopped because I was tired, but I saw a doorman in orange behind me, so I kept going. The next bits are quite blurry, but I was running, and I get clipped by this car. They weren't going fast, but it hit me and I fell. I tried to get up, but the first doorman in orange has swiped my legs and takes me to the floor. I remember the man get out of the car and start shouting, but I can't really remember anything else. I remember being in pain and something hitting my face, but nothing explicit.
It is the prosecution's case that, although Callum Moore was under the influence of alcohol, the defendants used excessive and unfair force to restrain him. resulting in serious damage to his face. There are 3 independent witnesses to this assault, all who have submitted statements stating they saw the defendants kick, punch, and stamp on the complainant, causing serious injury.
My girlfriend and I attended an all-day concert earlier in the day. We'd been drinking since about midday. We left around 9 or half 9 and began walking home, but on the way we saw some kind of incidents. On the other side of the road, in front of the concert hall, I could see a male lying on the pavement face down and restrained. His legs were hanging over the curb into the road. A bus passed by and he screamed, trying to indicate that a bus was passing, and it must have only just missed. There were 2 males, with the male that had been restrained. I drew the conclusion that both of these males were door staff because they were wearing earpieces and had IDs on their upper arms. The 2 door staff were literally on top of the male. One of the men was kneeling on his head, and I could see both knees on his head. He was not just using his hands, so in my opinion, it looked like he was positioning his whole body weight on his head. I then thought I'd seen the man kneeling on his head kick the man restrained in the head from the crouching position. At first, I wasn't really sure whether I just imagined it or whether my mind was playing a trick on me. I said to my girlfriend what I'd just seen, and she said, "Don't be silly." However, after some time, what I saw was confirmed because I saw 2 more kicks like the first one. The other male had both his knees on the small of the man's back. He had the male's hands restrained behind his back, holding him down. I was about 3 to 5 meters away from the scene now, and then I saw the first male move his weight from his knees to his hands, so he was holding him down with his hands. He was crouching next to him, which is when he then drove his right foot into the male's face on the right hand side. This male was on the right, and the other, who hadn't kicked him and just held him down, was on the left. My girlfriend has seen what I had seen. It made her quite distressed, and she started crying. There was nothing I'd witnessed from the restrained male that was justify anything that I'd witnessed. I think they must have known they did something bad, because I said I have evidence of this now. And the other who did the kicking shouted back aggressively to fuck off.
On this evening, I was in a restaurant across from Concert Street, sat by the window. My attention was drawn to a male of larger build who was pointing and what looked like shouting. He was doing this towards 2 males who were restraining another male on the floor. I then saw one of the males, who was wearing black, position the man on the floor, arms behind his back, and he was face down. I think this male was holding his face to the floor. The male was straddling the pavement. His legs were dangling off the curb, and the upper part of his body was on the pavement. His legs were facing the corner house. The male in the jacket had his back to me and was crouching down to the left-hand side of the male behind his back, and I believe the other arm was holding his head due to the position of his arm. The male in the orange t-shirt then crouched down beside the male on the ground. He was crouching to the right-hand side of the male on the ground. This meant that my view of the male in the orange t-shirt was not obscured by the male in the black coat. I saw clearly the male in the orange with his right hand deliver 3 quick punches in quick succession, literally one after the other and with some force behind them. I wish to add here I could see no struggling or any resistance by the man on the floor. I then saw the male in the orange stand up and stamp on his head. Not a kick, a proper stamp, at least twice. I saw a guy walk past the scene with a girl. The male remained restrained on the floor, and occasionally the other male would deliver some hits. The male in black positioned what such I could not see the restrained male's head for all of the blows. However, the direction of the strikes was obviously to the centre, to the area of the male's head.
That day I had been at an all-day concert with my boyfriend and we left around 9:30. We were walking home when he said, "I've just seen him kicking him in the head." I didn't know what he was talking about, so I looked around and saw 3 people on the floor nearby. On looking at these other people, I have seen 2 bouncers kneeling on another male's head. The male being knelt on was on his front, facing down to the ground. He had his hands behind his back and the 2 bouncers appeared to be restraining him. The restrained man was lying on the floor. His top half of his body was in the taxi bay. His bottom half was on the road. As a result of him being in the road, I could see cars having to steer around him. The man in orange had his knee on the other male's back and his other knee on his head. The other male had a knee on his neck. I could see that the man on the floor could not move and did not appear to be trying to. We moved further down the road. We stood still and watched what was happening. I then see the male in orange stand up from what he was doing and kick the man on the floor in the head. My boyfriend called over to them and said he'd just seen that, and the two men shouted over and told him to mind our business or something like that. At this point, a lot more people came to watch, and now the men had gone back to just holding him down. The male on the floor was not trying to get free or anything, so I explained this to the police when they got there. I think the two men used excessive force, and I was shocked by what I saw.
During the initial entry, 2 males were searched for drugs, but we didn't find any, so they were let in. About 20 minutes later, one of the men were observed acting suspiciously in the smoky area. He was shadowboxing and moving his hands uncontrollably in a way that security deemed was due to the consumption of drugs. As a result, he was denied re-entry. He then became very abusive, making threats to the door staff. His friend came out of the club and joined him in the abusive behaviour. The friend had to be restrained and removed from the stairs at the back of Luna Lux. Both males left claiming to come back and get security. Roughly 20 minutes later, the males returned and again started making threats that he was going to come back to the security personnel and they were going to get it. Due to the fact they were underage, people stood outside. The pair were approached in an attempt to ask them to stop shouting, but they both left at this point and no physical contact was made. At about 21:15, the male returned. He immediately threw a glass towards the entrance where door staff stood. This glass did not hit anyone and just hit the wall and broke. He then threw a second glass which hit a 17-year-old in the face. This caused a cut on his face and immediately started bleeding. The male who threw it took off running. He was pursued at this point he was hit by a silver Mercedes car travelling around 20 to 30 miles per hour. After being run over, he then got up and continued running. At this point, I had caught up with him and tackled him to the ground. He continued to resist and tried to escape, at which time the other doorman arrived and helped restrain him. He continued to resist and was grabbing at my pocket and at my testicles. Whilst he was swinging trying to get a pocket, which we saw as an attempt to potentially obtain a further weapon, I struck him twice in the shoulder area as a means of attempting to prevent him on doing so. This worked and his right arm was pulled away and bent up his back and at the elbow in an attempt to further prevent him from obtaining potential weapons. He continued to resist and struggled the whole time he was detained. Somebody from the Mercedes which had run the male over got out of the car and shouted at us to move the male out the road. He was moved a few feet out of the road into the lay-by. From here the police were contacted. When police arrived they lifted him up and an ambulance was called. Passers-by who saw the male restrained on the floor began heckling abuse at us before police arrived. We told them that the reason that he was being restrained was because he had glassed a child. I saw many of these witnesses talking to each other about what happened.
At approximately 8, Ryan was outside the club smoking with friends and shadowboxing. It was strange behaviour and he seemed to be under the influence of drugs, so he was refused entry. I hadn't seen him before in the club or outside. About 20 minutes pass and I hear a glass smash, so I look over and the male's returned carrying pint glasses. He then threw another one and hit someone in the face. He runs and so me and my colleague follow him. I didn't know how much damage he had done, just knew he had hit some kid in the face and we had to stop him. I and another colleague chased after him. In the pursuit he was struck by a car that sent him into the floor. The car was going about 20 miles an hour. He fell but tried to get up, which is when me and my colleague kicked his feet from under him and he went down pretty hard on his face. This had probably been how he got his injuries when he was hit by the car. We then restrained him and I had his left arm and my colleague had his right. I restrained lots of people so I know how to do it without causing harm. We then moved him out the way of the road and he was going mental, moving around and trying to get free, swinging his arms and stuff. At this point, a lot of people had started crowding around and a few minutes before the police arrived, his behaviour changed and he calmed down. When the police got there, we got off him and gave our statements. I do remember seeing the couple and the older man talking to each other when the police got there.
It is the defence's case that, although Callum Moore suffered serious injuries, these injuries were as a result of his own actions. The defendants are experienced doormen and consider Callum Moore to be a threat to themselves and others. The force they administered was justified, and injuries sustained were caused by Callum Moore's actions and resistance. Moreover, CCTV was seen by a police officer of the restraint, and he stated to have seen no evidence on the CCTV. Similarly, 2 witnesses confessed to being intoxicated, and all witnesses were seen by police talking after the incident. This suggests they are not 3 independent witnesses.
This CCTV footage showed a male being detained by 2 bouncers. The camera which captured this incident is camera 10 and ran from 10:31, which was an hour fast. Due to the system being a new system, the manager was unable to burn off the CCTV, but he had been provided with an incident number to update the control room once this is ready for collection in the morning. This footage shows a male being detained on the ground by a member of a door staff, with another door staff member stood close by. At no point did I witness any violence offered to the detained male by either police officer or door staff. Since this time, the CCTV has been deleted by personnel due to the system being new and not knowing how to use it.
The complainant, Callum Moore, was brought to hospital by ambulance. He denied loss of consciousness or vomiting. He had bleeding from his nose and possibly from his mouth. He underwent a CT scan of his head, which showed extensive soft tissue swelling over the left frontal and pre-orbital region of Mr. Callum Moore's brain, and he had a nasal bone fracture noted. There was no sign of brain injury. This CT scan was later reported as also showing a fracture to the right side of Mr. Callum Moore's jawbone. On assessment on the ward round the next morning, it was noted that Mr. Callum Moore felt bruised and weak, but had not vomited. He was unable to eat as his mouth was too painful. He had some pain to the left side of his chest and some dizziness on standing. To summarise, Mr. Callum Moore had a broken nose and a broken jaw.
I'm about to deliver my final remarks as a member of the judiciary. Members of the jury, in this case you have heard 2 competing accounts of the same event, one of which amounts to grievous bodily harm, GBH, and the other of which amounts to a lawful use of force. Now then, the prosecution have invited you to convict the defendant on the charge of grievous bodily harm, arguing that irrespective of the effects of the alcohol, the complainant, Callum, was not a threat and did not require the force needed to restrain. His capacities were lessened by the alcohol and he did not pose the threat the defence suggest. Moreover, the defendants kicked, punched and stamped on Callum's head, again illustrating the excessive and unjust force used. They suggest under the current law, this in itself amounts to grievous bodily harm. The defence, however, on the other hand, invites you to acquit the defendants on the charge of grievous bodily harm, arguing instead that the evidence you've heard from the complainant and witnesses is made up of patchy memory, restricted views, and doesn't adequately display the threat Callum was imposing. The defence suggests that the complainant was a credible threat, and that not only did the defendants believe the complainant could cause them harm, but he had also caused harm earlier that night. The force used was therefore justified, and the injuries sustained were due to the complainant's own resilience and aggression. Whether the events took place as has been described is a matter for you to decide. Now, before I inform you of the relevant matters of law that you should consider, I must first draw your attention to the experience of the court in similar cases. You will recall at the beginning of the trial I explained that it is my role to give directions on the law, but it's your collective role to be the judge of the facts. Now, when making judgments about these facts, you must disregard any stereotypes you hold about what is a typical assaulter, or indeed an assault victim. Indeed, there's no classic offender, the same way as that there's no classic response of a victim. You must judge the evidence dispassionately and not based on your emotions or any other biases, conscious or unconscious, that you feel you may have. You must also be aware of the burden and the standard of proof in criminal trials such as this. The burden of proof lies with the prosecution, and what this means is that it is not for the defendant to prove his innocence, but for the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, to prove his guilt. In order for you to accept that they have displayed this guilt, you must also collectively agree that it was displayed beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, when determining what is a reasonable doubt, we simply state that you must be sure to return a guilty verdict. Anything less than being sure of the defendant's guilt, and you must return a not guilty verdict. You should also be aware that you do not need to decide every issue in the case, only the issues that are important to the verdict, and these I will shortly bring to your attention. Likewise, if I've left something out of my summary that you think is important or included something that you disagree with, well, that's fine. You may disregard it or include it in your discussions. Just remember that it's you, not me, who is the judge of the facts. Overall, it is for you to weigh up the evidence and testimony and ultimately decide upon crucial aspects of the case and whether they make you sure or not of the defendant's guilt. Well, thank you very much. In terms of legal instructions, if the indictment contains more than one count, the jury should be directed to consider each one. The jury must reach a verdict on each count separately. In some cases, it may be necessary to give a further detailed explanation, sometimes described as oblique, as distinct from direct intention. Under this definition, a court or jury may find that the result is intended, though it is not D's purpose to cause it, when one, the result is a virtually certain consequence of that act, and two, that D knows that it is virtually a certain consequence. The following directions may also be necessary depending on the evidence and issues. Number one, the prosecution do not have to prove that the offence was planned or that D's intention was formed in advance. It is sufficient if D had the required intention at the time D committed the act or did what is alleged. Number two, although the prosecution must prove that D intended the result concerned, they do not have to prove that D had any particular motive or desire to bring about that result. Number three, the fact that D may have regretted afterwards what he or she had done does not negate any intention that D held at the time to do it. And number four, when deciding whether D had the required intention, the jury are entitled to consider as appropriate D's age, maturity, or any other relevant learning difficulty or mental or personality disorder referred to in the evidence. The Criminal Law Act of 1967, Section 3, states that, firstly, a person may use such force as is reasonable in the circumstances in the prevention of crime, or in effecting or assisting in the lawful arrest of offenders or suspected offenders, or of persons unlawfully at large. And secondly, subsection 1 of the above shall replace the rules of the common law on the question when force used for a purpose mentioned in the subsection is justified by that purpose. And finally, good character evidence may be admissible, firstly, to bolster the accused's credibility, and secondly, as relevant to the likelihood of guilt. This has been accepted by the Court of Appeal, most prominently by the House of Lords in the Aziz case 512 and by the 5-member Court of Appeal in Hunter. Okay.
Members of the jury, you will now be asked to go to the jury room and attempt to reach your verdict. Please bear in mind that the facts in this case are drawn from a real case, and the decisions you make are going to have important implications in the understanding of this case. With this in mind, we ask that you treat the deliberation as if you are in a real trial. Thank you.